She was 24 years old. She stood barely 5 feet tall and had a laugh you could hear from the parking lot of the diner where she worked. On the night of September 8, 1990, Rachel Doyle finished her shift, waved goodnight to the cook through the kitchen window, and walked out to her car in the lot behind Cedar Mill Diner, and never made it home. That is not a story about a waitress who left work late one night. That is a story about a man half the town called a friend, standing close enough to shake hands with her family at every funeral, every wedding, every church potluck for the next 34 years. And it would take a detective who refused to let his own case retire with him. A Dina lab that didn't exist when Rachel disappeared, and one cigarette butt tossed in a gravel lot to finally expose him. But before we get to any of that, we have to go back to that Saturday night. Because to understand what Cedar Mill lost, you first have to understand who Rachel Doyle was. Cedar Mill, Delaware, in 1990, was the kind of small town wedged between farmland and the Delaware Bay, where everyone's kids ended up working the same 3 or 4 jobs: the diner, the feed store, the marina down at the landing. The air in September still held on to summer, thick with the smell of tomatoes rotting in the fields after harvest and salt drifting up from the bay on an east wind. Cedar Mill didn't have a stoplight. It had a Methodist church, a VFW hall, and a diner that stayed open past midnight on weekends because half the county's teenagers needed somewhere to go after the movie theater in the next town closed. On Friday nights, you could hear a Phillies game crackling out of a transistor radio propped in somebody's truck window in the diner lot. And most families still had a party line they shared with 2 other households down the road. Everybody in Cedar Mill knew Rachel Doyle's laugh before they knew her name. Rachel was the oldest of 2, the one who'd stayed home while her younger brother went off to college, the one everyone assumed would leave too and never quite did, not because she lacked ambition, but because she loved that diner. Loved the regulars who tipped her in loose change and conversation. Loved the way Cedar Mill felt like a place where nothing bad had ever really happened. She waited tables in scuffed white sneakers she resold twice rather than replace, because they were the only pair that didn't hurt her feet after a double shift. She was saving tip money in a coffee can under her bed for a trip to the ocean she'd never actually taken, despite living 20 minutes from it her whole life. Her mother, Marion, ran the church nursery on Sundays, patient with every crying infant in the county. Her father, Tom, worked the docks at the marina and had taught Rachel to drive a stick shift in the church parking lot the summer she turned 16, cursing good-naturedly every time she stalled it out. Rachel had a habit of double-checking that her car doors were locked, twice. Every single time, a small ritual nobody thought twice about, until it mattered. Cedar Mill in 1990 did not believe anything happened to its own. That belief held the whole town together, the diner that stayed open past midnight without a second thought, the unlocked back door at the marina, the way strangers' cars got noticed and talked about before they'd even parked. Nobody in Cedar Mill that September had any reason to think that belief was wrong. That was the last month anyone in the Doyle family would believe it either. At 11:40 that night, Rachel clocked out at the diner, same as she did most Saturdays, and told the cook she'd see him Tuesday. At 11:47, a customer leaving the diner noticed her car still parked in the back lot, engine off. Driver's door open a few inches. He didn't think much of it. Figured she'd forgotten something inside. By 12:15 a.m., the cook noticed the same thing on his own way out and called the Doyle house. Marion answered on the second ring. Tom was in the truck within 5 minutes. By 1 a.m., Tom was standing in that gravel lot himself, staring at his daughter's open car door, her purse still sitting on the passenger seat, keys still in the ignition. Cold, silent by 1:30, Cedar Mill's 2-man police department had the lot taped off. By 3 a.m., state police had joined them. No blood, No obvious struggle, just an open door, and a young woman gone. By dawn, half the town was in that parking lot. Neighbors walked the tree line behind the diner. Someone brought coffee for the search line before the sun was even fully up. Gerald Weiss, who ran the hardware store 2 doors down and had known Rachel her whole life, was one of the first men out there with a flashlight, walking the fields behind the diner shoulder to shoulder with Tom Doyle. 3 days of searching turned up nothing. No body, no car theft, no witness who'd seen anything beyond a stranger's sedan that nobody could ever fully describe. One detail got logged and forgotten that first week. 3 cigarette butts found near the tree line at the edge of the gravel lot, 20 feet from where Rachel's car had been parked, not matching any brand the cook or any regular at the diner smoked. Deputies bagged them anyway, out of habit more than expectation. In 1990, a cigarette butt told you nothing except that someone, at some point, had smoked a cigarette. It went into an evidence box and stayed there for over 3 decades. Detective Vincent Palco took the case that week, 11 years into the job. The kind of detective who believed every unsolved case was a personal failure rather than bad luck. He kept Rachel's missing persons flyer taped inside his desk drawer, the same way he kept every open case close, so it was the first thing he saw every single morning before anything else. For Rachel Doyle, that flyer stayed there for the rest of his career. 2 threads ran side by side that fall. Officially, Palco and the state police canvassed every house and business within 10 miles, questioned truckers who'd passed through the county that weekend, and followed a tip about a sedan seen near the diner that led nowhere solid. Palco's own notes from that first month describe a county eager to help and short on anything usable. Half the tips that came in were people describing cars they'd seen on the highway that had nothing to do with the case at all. One name did come up early and hard. A man who'd been fired from the diner 2 months earlier after an argument with the owner, and who'd been seen in town the week Rachel disappeared. On paper, he looked almost too convenient. A grudge, a motive, a reason to have been lurking near that lot. Palco chased that lead for nearly a year, tracked the man to a job in Maryland, and cleared him completely. He'd been working a night shift 2 counties away, verified by a time card, and 3 coworkers who all placed him on site the exact night Rachel vanished. It was Cedar Mill's first dead end, and it cost the investigation nearly a full year of momentum. Palco would say later that clearing that man felt like losing ground rather than gaining it, because it meant whoever had taken Rachel wasn't some drifter or disgruntled ex-employee passing through. But he didn't let that thought all the way in yet, not for a long time. By the winter of 1990, the search had scaled down to occasional tips, most going nowhere, and a handful of calls from psychics whose visions never matched anything investigators found on the ground. The physical evidence sat in a single box at the county building: the cigarette butts, a partial tire impression from the gravel lot, a diner receipt from that night that told investigators nothing they didn't already know. Palco kept driving the back roads on his own weekends anyway, stopping at farmhouses to ask questions that had already been asked twice before. Personally, Tom and Marion Doyle kept living in a house with a bedroom neither of them could bring themselves to touch. Rachel's shoes stayed by the back door for years, exactly where she'd have kicked them off after a shift. Rachel's coffee can of Ocean Trip savings stayed exactly where she'd left it, under a bed nobody slept in anymore. Marion stopped attending the Cedar Mill 4th of July picnic after 1991. Rachel had loved that picnic, had worked the lemonade stand there every summer since she was 12. And Marion couldn't stand in that crowd without searching every face in it. The institutional failure that would follow Palco for the rest of his career was a simple one. In 1990, nobody seriously considered someone Rachel already knew and trusted. Investigators' files from that fall show they questioned strangers, truckers, a fired employee, but not the men who'd stood beside Tom Doyle in that search line at dawn, flashlights in hand, coffee in the other. Why would you suspect the man who organized the search parties himself? The town rallied for months, and then, as small towns do, slowly went back to its rhythms. Store shelves restocked. The diner reopened within a week. Cedar Mill never stopped being Cedar Mill for anyone except the Doyles. By 1995, 5 years had passed, and the search parties were a memory. The missing person flyer taped in the diner's front window had faded to something barely legible, but nobody ever took it down. Families moved into 2 different houses on the Doyle street over those first 5 years, and each set of new neighbors learned, gently and quickly, not to ask about the girl in the photograph everyone in town still seemed to remember. New owners eventually bought the diner itself in 1998, and even they kept that flyer up out of respect, not fully understanding anymore who the girl in the photograph had been to the town. By 2003, Tom Doyle had aged in a way that had nothing to do with the calendar. He retired from the marina early, couldn't stand the docks anymore without thinking of teaching Rachel to drive in that church lot. But he and Marion never left Cedar Mill, in case Rachel ever came looking for the house. That same year, the county repaved the gravel lot behind the diner, and Palco drove out himself to walk the tree line one more time before the asphalt went down, just in case there was anything left to find. By 2011, Rachel's younger brother had children of his own, kids who knew an aunt only through a single photograph on the hallway wall, a young woman frozen forever at 24 while their own parents grayed around her. Every one of those grandchildren grew up understanding, without ever quite being told why, that nobody in the family talked much about the diner. Detective Vincent Palco retired in 2014. He did not stop working Rachel's case. He kept the file, 4 cardboard boxes by then, in his own garage, and whenever a new forensic technique made the news, he drove it to the state lab himself and asked them to try again. In 2016, he requested new testing on the cigarette butts. The samples were degraded enough that the lab could only produce a partial profile, not enough for a match. He filed the results and kept waiting. Marion Doyle died in 2019. The coffee can still tucked under that same bed. Tom kept it there after her, dusting around it but never once moving it. Every September 8th, without fail, he drove to the gravel lot behind the diner, stood near where Rachel's car had been found, and stayed until the sun went down. Gerald Weiss, who still ran the hardware store 2 doors down, was often one of the people who saw him out there, and every year, without fail, he was the one who walked over, put a hand on Tom's shoulder, and told him he was sorry, as if he were simply an old friend rather than the reason Tom was standing there at all. The town moved on around Tom. He never did. Every case on this channel represents weeks of digging through records, verifying facts, and piecing together real lives that were lost. If you want us to keep uncovering the truth behind stories like this one, please take a second to like this video, subscribe, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Your support is what makes this possible. Now, let's get back to Rachel. Then, in 2024, something happened that no one in Cedar Mill had dared to expect. It would take a full DNA profile finally pulled from evidence too degraded to test in 1990, and a genealogy database built for people hunting their own family trees to break open a case even the Doyles had quietly stopped believing would ever resolve. On a Monday morning in February, a forensic analyst at the state lab was running one of the cigarette butts through a new extraction process, developed specifically for degraded decades-old samples, when a usable profile finally came back where 3 previous attempts had failed. She cross-referenced it against a public ancestry database. The process works the same way anyone might trace their own family tree. Crime scene DNA gets uploaded and compared against genetic profiles that ordinary people have voluntarily submitted while researching their own ancestry. And investigators build outward from any distant relative match until the branches narrow down to a single person. A distant cousin match flagged on the screen. She read the name twice, then called the number still listed for Vincent Palco, retired 10 years, because she knew from the file that he'd want to hear it before anyone else did. Palco later said he sat in his kitchen with the phone in his hand for a full minute before he trusted himself to speak. He drove the 4 boxes of files to the county building that same afternoon, the way he'd done for a quarter of a century, except this time he believed, for the first time in years, that it might actually matter. The genealogy team spent the following weeks tracing that single distant match through a family tree spanning 3 states, ruling out cousin after cousin, until the DNA pointed to one family with deep roots in Cedar Mill, and one branch of it led straight to a name nobody in that town had ever once considered: Gerald Weiss. The man who ran the hardware store 2 doors from the diner. The man who'd walked the search line himself in 1990, who'd organized coffee for the searchers at dawn, who'd stood beside Tom Doyle at every single anniversary for 34 years with a hand on his shoulder and a word of sympathy. Gerald Weiss had never even been formally questioned in 1990. He wasn't a stranger, wasn't a fired employee, wasn't anyone investigators had reason to look at twice. He'd spent the next 3.5 decades as one of the most trusted men in Cedar Mill. First, understand how normal he seemed. Weiss had run that hardware store for over 40 years. He sponsored the Little League team every spring without being asked. He was the man half the town called first if a water heater failed or a fence needed mending, always willing to drive out after hours if someone was truly stuck. He donated the flagpole outside the VFW Hall in 1996, a small act of civic pride nobody thought twice about. For 34 years, Gerald Weiss was, by every visible measure, one of the most decent men in Cedar Mill. Second, the small things that only made sense in hindsight. Neighbors who recalled, only when finally asked directly, that Weiss had stopped smoking abruptly that same September in 1990, cold turkey, after nearly 20 years of a pack-a-day habit, and had always brushed off questions about why with a joke about his health, that he'd sold his own car within 2 months of Rachel's disappearance, telling people it was time for something newer, though the car had been barely 3 years old, that he flinched every single September, at the anniversary, he himself never missed marking with the Doyles, and that everyone had always read that flinch as grief on their behalf, rather than what it actually was. Third, the moment the truth became undeniable. Investigators obtained a warrant for a direct DNA sample from Weiss, now 71 years old, still running the same hardware store, still attending the same small church as the Doyles. The sample matched the profile from the cigarette butt with a certainty the lab called conclusive. A match so specific it left no room for coincidence. When detectives arrived at his store to make the arrest, Weiss reportedly said nothing at first, then told them quietly, "I wondered when this day would come." Word moved through Cedar Mill within the hour. People who'd bought nails and paint from him for 40 years sat in their kitchens that night, unable to speak. The town that had believed nothing bad could happen inside its own borders now had to reckon with the fact that the worst thing that had ever happened there had been standing behind the hardware store counter the entire time, ringing up their purchases, remembering their kids' birthdays, showing up at every single vigil for the woman he'd taken. The community's reaction wasn't disbelief so much as a slow, sick recalibration. People quietly running back through decades of small interactions with Gerald Weiss, wondering what they'd missed, wondering what else, in a town this small, could still be hiding in plain sight behind a friendly face. Weiss was charged with Rachel Doyle's murder. He pled guilty rather than face trial, and in a taped statement Palco insisted on hearing in person, he told investigators where he had left her remains that night in 1990. A wooded ravine less than a mile from the diner. Land that had since become part of a small county park. Nobody had ever thought to search that closely. He was sentenced to life in prison. He was 71 years old. Rachel Doyle was 24 years old. She had a laugh people remembered decades later without being able to explain exactly why. She had a coffee can of savings for a trip to the ocean she never got to take, 20 minutes from where she grew up. She had a future that belonged to her by right, and Gerald Weiss took it from her on an ordinary Saturday night in a town that believed, with its whole heart, that nothing like that could happen there. Tom Doyle, 78 years old by the time of the arrest, was finally able to bury his daughter's remains beside her mother's grave, 34 years after he'd last hugged her goodbye. He told reporters only this: "I stood in that lot every September for 34 years. I just didn't know I was standing next to the reason I was there." How many other small towns are still carrying a version of Gerald Weiss inside them right now? A man everyone trusts precisely because no one has ever had a reason to look closely. What does it say about justice that the thing which finally broke this case open was a piece of technology built for people looking up their family trees for fun, not for chasing down killers? And what do we owe the families who spend decades keeping a coffee can under a bed, refusing to let the world forget what it would rather move past? Justice came for Rachel Doyle after 34 years. Her story is a reminder that truth, however late, has a way of finding the light, even when it takes a lifetime, and even when it was standing behind the counter shaking your hand the entire time. If this story moved you, subscribe so you don't miss the next case we uncover, and let us know in the comments where in the world you're watching from. Thank you for watching.